In thinking about talking today, rather than really giving you an elaborate discussion about pedagogy and teaching photography, I'm going to be talking a little bit more personally about my work and how the issues that I'm engaged with in my personal research then overlap, and I hope that you'll get more of a sense of it rather than me being very explicit about it. And I'm happy to take questions then if people are more interested in the kind of programmatics about teaching art and teaching photography. And I think for those of you who are here with the Logan Art Center, people obviously see that there's a really different kind of attention and kind of presence of the arts on campus. And for me, this is my 18th year here. I started here in 1994, and the past 10 weeks, while they were really hectic because we moved from Midway Studios into the new Logan Art Center, so there was a huge upheaval, but they've been really, really tremendous, and the facility is fantastic, and I hope that everyone gets a chance to get over there and take a look at it. But it really has shown the university's intense investment and belief in visual arts as a way of experiencing and understanding the world. And what always interests me in teaching here is the fact that I work with so many students, very few of whom are BA majors in the Department of Visual Arts. But of the students that I work with, many of them do go on and do master's degrees in the fine arts or go on to arts-related careers, whether it's art history or other kinds of things. But the vast majority of the students that I work with end up doing economics degree, poli-sci, a lot of pre-med students. And one of the things that we hear a lot is that other departments really appreciate the kinds of knowledge that students get from working in the visual arts. And for me, being a photographer, I'm really interested in the way that photography is both the most familiar of all art forms. You see it everywhere. You see it on the brochures that you're looking at today. You see it on the sides of buses, magazines, and television. Photographic media are everywhere, and yet at the same time we're kind of unconscious about the way that it operates on us. We don't really, it operates on a subconscious level rather than us really often articulating how it works. And one of my interests is trying to unpack and to problematize some of the ways that we encounter photography and the ways that we encounter ideas about the world through photography as a kind of pedagogy about the world and about how to be in the world. So I'm going to start out with these two images. One on the left is a very early picture from when I was an undergraduate in college, and I was interested in photographing. It looks funky on my thing, but it looks okay there. I was interested with the camera and how it gave me a kind of permission to look at things in the world. And so I would go out to different fairs and festivals, and this was a stripper contest in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The voyeurism was something the camera, seems perfectly suited for. And then the image, so that photograph on the left was taken, gosh, I want to say 1983 or 84. And the image on the right is one of the more recent works of mine from Ill Form and Void Full that I produced, that I made last year, so 2011. So there's quite a large gap of time that happened. And it's funny because when I did the work on the right, I used to always think that I'd photograph people, and I had certain ideas. You have ideas about photography or ideas about the way that things are supposed to be. And if somebody would have told me that this was the kind of photograph that I'd be making, 40 years later or whatever, I would have said there's absolutely no way. So I'm going to talk about the relationship between what I was doing and how I was thinking and my education, both as an undergraduate, as a graduate who did a degree at Yale in photography, and then now my education and my teaching here at the university. And I'm actually going to propose that these two pictures have a lot more in common than you might initially think in first glance. They're both about wanting. They're both about need. They're both about a kind of centrifugal force within the photographic space and a sense of ambiguity and ambivalence about what the photograph offers, a kind of pretense and a kind of seduction that photography affords or avails. This is a series of works that I began when I was in graduate school at Yale doing my MFA. And I was very interested from the work that was much more differently voyeuristic, where I was going to public events and contests. I became really interested in areas in the world that were deemed less than. So the idea of romance and love being, on the one hand, one of the most ubiquitous areas of expression, like all the millions and billions of love songs that there are in the world, and all the Hallmark greeting cards, and all the work that is done about love. And yet it's not taken seriously as sort of high intellectual or artistic pursuit. It's thought of as being sentimental and sappy and emotional. And there's a lot of going back, before Plato, but certainly going back to Plato, ideas that art, sort of gets you all fired up and makes you think irrationally. And there's associations or alliances to love and art, and the way that art misguides you. Art is not real. It's a kind of it's artifice. And then love also is something that blinds you or sways you. It perfumes or changes the atmosphere. And I was really interested in photographing romance and in thinking about the photograph's role in the way that we understand how to be in love, what our expectations of romance and love are from a gender perspective, as well as issues of like race and class and sexual orientation. I did a series of photographs of couples, and they were in different kinds of activities, so ranging from this, which is a more of a private scene and seeing. And I was interested by photographers such as E.J. Belloc, a photographer who worked in New Orleans in the 1920s, photographing prostitutes in New Orleans. And there was a lot of controversy around who he was and then what the pictures meant because of who he was. It was early on theorized by John Sarkowski, the curator at the Museum of Modern Art, that this photographer, E.J. Belloc, was severely handicapped, and thus these photographs of the different women were a way for him to, and he writes this, to make love to the women because he wasn't physically capable of doing this. So the photographs were kind of homage or a sense of seduction to the women. Later on, Janet Malcolm, writer for the New York Review of Books, went and did more research and found out that, in fact, E.J. Belloc was a dandy. He would walk around New Orleans in a top hat and go to all the different brothels and bars and, have a good time, presumably. And so these photographs then suddenly changed their meaning. They became, what were they, salacious. And I was really interested in the way that, money and sex muddy the valuation of art, so that if an artist makes work for money, it's not for their pure intentions. It gets mired in, capital, and therefore it's corrupt. Or if there's a sexual dimension, it again has a kind of nastiness to it. And I was interested in a modernist strain of thinking that wants to see art as being somehow pure and above or beyond or outside of those very base human needs. And yet the base human needs are again what make us human. It's what unites us. And so I've always been attracted to these areas or these arenas that are about humanness and animalness and need and want. I continued on this work for, from 1989 through 1995, initially photographing other couples and then moving into photographing myself, realizing that I was not making portraits that were true, but there was a kind of storytelling dimension that interested me, and that the photograph was always going to be some tension between it being truthful and it being a story or a narrative. And so I began to use myself, and I was very interested in the way that visual traditions stemming from historic paintings, such as this is a Mantegna Renaissance deposition of Christ. I think it's from 1464, but I'm guessing on that. I can't remember the exact date. The way that religious paintings informs us about what love and romance looks like, and how so much of the writing and the visual and verbal articulation about love that was sacred-based through the Renaissance and into the 1800s with Enlightenment, then moved into discussions on a secular level, and love as the supreme emotion supersedes the love that was associated as being a sacred love historically, through the Renaissance. And images of Christ, which were intended as showing him supine and showing his passivity as a way of describing his character and certain associations that were related to the Bible and beliefs in the Bible, then took on a different intonation in a contemporary situation where to see a figure lying prostrate the way that Christ is, a male figure is very unusual. It's usually women that are showing lying down and men that are shown standing up. And so just these reversals of gender giving us cues as to how to understand what it is we're looking at. And Leo Bersani has written extensively about the sexuality of Christ in Renaissance painting. And this was something that I used to inform my practice, as well as the formulation of romance in Annunciation paintings, where ostensibly you have a seduction, and I don't mean to be heretical, but ostensibly you're looking at a seduction. The angel Gabriel comes in, bearing either flowers, and sometimes he has a sword, and he shows Mary or tells Mary, informs her that she is going to bear God's child. Mary is often ignoring her needlework and instead reading the Bible, being inseminated by the word of the Bible. And Joseph's somewhere off. He's not part of this particular scene. And I was interested in the structure of these Annunciation scenes and the way that Mary is always shown in an enclosed environment. The paintings are always very symmetrical, and Gabriel, whatever is behind Gabriel, you get an illusion of three-dimensionality. And so there's this tension between the way that the male figure is shown and the way the female figure is shown that just it becomes an expectation that then you see throughout history. And I was trying to use that same formation, visual form, to set up expectations of male and female and gender and love in some of the pictures that I was making, and using what you see as well as what you don't see to structure your reading of the story. From here, this is actually a transitional moment here from 1996, when I realized that my interest in photographing people and in the truth or the story that a person could carry was less interesting to me than the structure of the space that the photograph provided, and the way that people's environment, to me, told much more, could be used psychologically to frame what was happening. And I became more interested in people's homes. And rather than, I think that you can tell from the previous picture that I want the people to kind of be out of the picture. I'm flattening them, I'm pulling them out to the edges, I'm removing them. And what I'm really interested in is the space, and in the way that the space and the objects in the space convey something about home, about identity, and to me, in a way that was it remains much more compelling. I've been working now on the series. That last photograph, was from 1997. I continued the project from when I first started it into Chicago. That other one was in Berlin. This is in Chicago. Building, again, off of the visual repertoire that precedes contemporary imaging, which is painting. And painting as the preceding, setting an example, setting up a visual language of expectations, using the still life to think about these scenes as allegories. And Norman Bryson wrote a fantastic book called Looking at the Overlooked, where he talks about conditions of creaturality and how different historical periods care about the still life and care about material culture around the home, and other moments in history you see nothing of the home and nothing of the objects. And so why is it, he asks, that certain historical moments, certain social periods necessitate the depiction of the home and the material objects, foodstuffs, things that, again, are very base and ordinary that unite all of us because everyone's got to eat and everyone's got to drink. But at certain moments that subject matter is considered worthy of representation and worthy of being depicted as art, and at other moments it's not. And so thinking about the Dutch Flemish 1700s as a period of great expansion, so huge global expansion where the Dutch are sailing all over the world. They're bringing back goods and exotic things that had not formerly been seen in Northern Europe. This scene has a walnut, which would have been a little bit rare, and grapes, which would have come from the south. There's the goblet that's painted. The lemon was an exotic object, whereas the bread might have been something that was much more ordinary and expected, as was the herring. And this mix of exotic, really cool stuff and the very ordinary was an allegory for how to experience life, very much related to what was happening in the world, where people were encountering new objects that were being given value in a particular way. Not only the objects, but the depiction of the objects became important. And this emphasis on not only the objects and on owning the objects and on owning these material possessions as a sign of wealth and as a sign of appreciativeness got translated into the owning of the paintings, or having the paintings made. So again, it's not just that the objects that bear the weight of being valued in a particular way, it's the description of the objects that demands the invention of photography. And it's always talked about as photography as an invention. And photography is less an invention and more a realization of a set of ideas and ideals about seeing that are evident through the Renaissance and through 17th century, a mix of Northern and Southern Renaissance traditions. So here, as Svetlana Alpers has talked about in really quite eloquently, there's a description of everything depicted with equal attention. So the herring and the bread that would have been something really ordinary and everyday and not thought of as being special is given the same attention as is the crystal goblet, hand-blown goblet, and the grapes and the lemon. Everything is considered made by God in a Protestant world, and so everything is given the same kind of attention. It's also looks sort of like the way that we see with our eyes. In other words, if you were looking at a scene, you'd look at me and you see me and I look, you can see what I look like. You can see this in front of me that looks, the way that you see with your eyes. And you can also focus on something that's around the room and that looks the way that you see it with your eyes. So trying to describe things in a way that seems like how our eyes operate becomes important. So the idea of verisimilitude. Verisimilitude, attention to detail, and then lastly, another issue that is integral to photography and the need for photography is the need to disseminate images. You have a long-standing Southern tradition of painting religious painting, even though the Bible explicitly states that you're not supposed to paint animate objects because it's, playing with, the control that God had is to this is Old Testament stuff, and we see it in the Quran also. You're not supposed to paint animate objects because it's basically playing at being God by making something that looks akin to what he has made. But yet the Southern Renaissance tradition, because the Bible is in Latin, there's a necessity to describe scenes in the Bible to tell the peasants who are largely illiterate and don't speak Latin what's happening in the Bible so that they can understand the story, so you can disseminate information pictorially. So you have this great, Renaissance tradition of biblical, allegorical painting. In the North, there's, again, a kind of prohibition about some of those depictions, but there's the desire to describe the world and to depict the world in a way to tell people about how to see and how to understand the world, that these things in this picture are important. They're important to appreciate, they're important to know about, they're important to own. It's important to spread this information. It's really an early form of advertising. So the demand for a kind of vision that is akin to what we see with our eyes, although not the same because it's monocular and fixed and a different color palette, but akin to how we see with our eyes, the need to disseminate images widely, to have them advertised so that you can tell everyone something is important, as is the idea of describing things with great deal of accuracy. And this precedes photography, because this is in the late 1700s and photography is invented in the 1800s. And people are, at this time, painters are trying to figure out, they're using devices like the camera obscura to depict the world through a monocular lens. And really, it's sort of a photographic technology, a photographing imaging technology. And the only thing that was lacking was the ability to fix the image. It took another 100 years to be able to describe it. So these images really, really interested me in the way that I was thinking about our contemporary culture, where we talk about the world as post-global, post-modern, post-capital, post-narrative, post-painting, post. And yet, what is this moment? I mean, I don't know that any of us are sort of sitting here feeling like it's all over. I mean, I hope that there's still things ahead. But yet the idea of things being over really interested me. And that also aligned with me with an idea that has always been very important about the photograph being after the fact. And Roland Barthes is a writer who I love dearly. And his book, Camera Lucida, he writes about the photograph as that has been. That the photograph is never in the present. It's always about the past. It's always something that happened in the past, but not only is it something that happened in the past, it never really happened except for photographically. The photograph changes what you see. The photograph isn't the truth. Rather, it's a photographic description of the world. It's a representation. And that idea of this moment that we're in right now, where you can go to the grocery store and get glasses that are made in Taiwan and fruits that are grown in the Philippines and tomatoes that are shipped from Mexico that don't taste very good, but we buy them anyways because they're red, but they're shipped from Mexico. And then you can also find things that are grown, 300 miles away. And just the way that we've become so used to this kind of global circulation of objects, so that our attention to material objects is so different than it must have been, 300 years ago looking at this painting. And the ubiquity of photography, the constant ability to feed an insatiable appetite for more, and the production of home through all of this, through photographic culture, all this stuff kind of came together for me in identifying the home and the still life as a genre that contained a great deal for me. And I'm going to look at some more of my work. I'm going to show some more of my work here. So I continued with this work, this is from 1998, trying to figure out how to use the camera to upset your expectations of what you're seeing, to have you look at the scene and the seeing, and to be on the one hand kind of seduced or drawn into things that look kind of beautiful, but then to be cognizant that what you're looking at is something that's no longer in existence, that's something that's over, and there's a sense of the stains or the remains that you're left with. And what do you make out of that? Because I don't mean this at all in a nihilistic way. I mean it, in fact, that all we ever have is what's been given to us, what's preceded us. All the ideas that you have in your head are things that you've absorbed or you've been fed. And so how does one think about something original? Where does original come from if everything already exists in the world? If every word has already been said, how do you say something new? If every picture's already been taken, how do you say something in a way that hasn't been said before? And so trying to think about mediating this idea of origin and the copy, that the photograph is some sort of copy or tracing of the world, to make these pictures that talk about that speak to the sense of things having been pictured before, but trying to see them anew, trying to destabilize your expectations of where you're standing in the room, and also to talk about this tradition on a formal level. So here, this is a Morandi painting, another artist who has been probably the most influential for me in the work, where he made these incredibly modest little paintings. They're quite small. I think the biggest one, is maybe 16 by 20. And for 80 years, he painted in his studio in Bologna a series of bottles and boxes and containers. But yet the paintings, for me, belie the ordinariness of what is in them. In other words, the paintings aren't about the white canister and the bottle and the other round shape. Rather, they're about a description of space, and they're described in a metaphysical, he's described as a metaphysical painter because they take you some other place. And what's interesting to me, and this is a problem that I have in teaching, is how to talk about work, because whenever you talk about artwork, there's always a translation problem because you're always talking about it. You're never talking it. The words are always somehow around it, and you're trying to describe and make words wrap around the thing. And yet, one of my complaints is that I don't think I've ever read anything really precise about Morandi's work, and I think it's because his work evades language. There's something really experiential that's really important about it. And another thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of teaching is the frustration I have in terms of trying to teach and trying to talk about artwork when this Morandi painting is this small, intense, very heavy with paint, brush-stroked object where it really has a kind of physical material presence to it. But whenever I teach, I'm always having to show things in this format where, it's better than slides, but not by much, so that you're looking at something that's, a 4x5 painting that looks the same as, a billboard. Everything it sort of homogenizes everything. And so in trying to teach art to students, it's trying to get them to understand also that experience of the world is really different than sitting in your dorm room and looking at things online, that you have to get out and go and see things. And I make my students look at work and go to see, we do a minimum of 4 field trips in a 10-week quarter, minimum, and I make them go and look at things and give them lists of things to go and see so that they can go on their own. Because I think that there's no way for me to communicate except for to push people. So part of my job as a teacher is just to push people and to provoke people and to get them to go and look at things so that there isn't just an acceptance of, yes, this is a Morandi, this is not a Morandi, this is like a really, really bad representation of a Morandi. And even my work in showing it here, the pictures that I make, I print quite precisely so that they're about a domestic size. So the prints are about 30 by 40 inches so that they feel like you could almost reach out and grab the cherry. There's a kind of illusion that I'm interested in setting up. And I use a large format camera so that the description, the verisimilitude is quite great. So again, it's a kind of seduction that I want to occur in the picture that then is counterbalanced by a bit of ickiness that isn't quite as, you can't quite see it in the digital projection, which again blows out a lot of the very fine detail. But all my photographs have, there's stains and traces and dirt and fingerprints and debris that gets photographed. I'm going to move a little bit quicker through some of this stuff because we're going to run out of time. These are continuing with the Hardly More Than Ever work. And as I continued to work, I became less convinced that I had to start with the original scene of the table, a meal that had been eaten. And I began to be much more constructed in my still lifes. Less interested in the notion of the photograph, again, having a place of origin, and instead it being about a kind of invention. In between, this is in 2004, I spent a year or two photographing people's empty homes. For me, the question from this photograph to this photograph was about trying to set the problem anew for myself so that it wasn't a matter of taking a bunch of objects and balancing the picture with a kind of elegance that I felt like I knew how to do, but trying to instead pose the problem for myself in a way that kept on asking questions or forcing the viewer into a precarious position of wondering what was going on. And so, I began to make these pictures that were about about home, about the idea of home, and what happens when you take out everything that identifies a home as such, and it becomes just walls and floor. And the pictures are very, I think, abstract and kind of like a color field, Rothko-esque. I mean, I wish it was as beautiful as a Rothko, but I was interested in the kind of flatness of the space. But then in around 2006, 2007, I had a studio, and this again is a part of my experience being here at the university, where I had always I live in Hyde Park because I have children, and there's no studio spaces in Hyde Park. There's very little industrial development around here, so there's not the same kind of spaces that one might use, and I wasn't able to have a space out. They were just, they keep me very busy here. And so in 2006, the university made an agreement to find studio spaces for art faculty within Hyde Park, and the Hyde Park Art Center has hosted faculty there. And so for the first time in, this is 2006, so the first time in 12 years, I again had a studio space. And it really fundamentally changed my practice. The question for me of what to make a picture of is where I start. It's what, if you can take a picture of anything, why take a picture of anything? Every picture has already been taken. You can go online and find a picture of anything. There's nothing that has not been photographed. Or I dare you to find something that has not been photographed. And so then the question is, well, what do you make photographs about? What do you put in front of the camera? What's worthy? What makes a photograph good? If you photograph the Tiffany diamond, does that make a valuable photograph? Or if you photograph the most ugly person in the world, does that make the ugliest picture in the world? What is the relationship between what's in the picture and what the picture is? And that's always been a real question for me of what is imaged, the photograph as an image, and the photograph as an object. And again, you're not seeing the photograph, you're seeing a digital representation of it. So it's not the same thing here. But thinking about this question and having a studio for the first time in 12 years and a number of other things conspiring in my life, I was at a point where I felt a little bit of, this was my nihilistic moment, where I felt a little bit that I wanted to try and make something out of nothing. And so every day, and I had a kind of writer's or photographer's block where I just really didn't know what to make photographs about. I just didn't know what to do. So I read a book Harry Matthews wrote called 20 Lines a Day. He's a novelist and editorialist. And he writes that he had a writing block and he set for himself the task of writing 20 lines a day. And after he wrote 20 lines a day, he could go to the bar, he could go see movies, he could read his favorite books, he could smoke cigarettes, he could do whatever he wanted. So I set myself the task of I would walk to my studio and whatever I found on the way to my studio, I would pick up and I had to make a picture of it. Once I made a picture of it that day, I was done. I could do whatever I wanted. And over time, I got really interested in it. So I would pick up the things that I found, which felt very much like, a Garden of Eden, but what was falling around me was, Orange Crush cans and dirty bags and pieces of plastic. And just the sense of like the world emitting garbage and the relationship between nature and culture. I was reading Michael Pollan and a whole bunch of other books about environmentalism and organic stuff. And I was just in this sort of political moment of trying to figure out, like, how do I add to this burgeoning, a sort of impossibly huge mass of photographic stuff? Why would I make another picture when there's already so much stuff out there? So I was trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear by using these objects. And this is at the time my son said something to me. He was angry at me, and he said, you can say it, but even if you say it, it isn't so. And so that struck me, like, you can say something, but even to photograph it, to say it, doesn't make it so. What is it that makes it so? So I call the series To Say It Isn't So. And I've been interested in using language in a kind of modernist sense, in a Gertrude Stein way, that the language shifts as you read, and words have different meanings depending upon their context. And so that the objects, the pink netting that you recognize and you can name as being pink netting is both pink netting, but it's also pink and it's round and it's a shape and it's a formal object. So the thing, in a sort of Wittgenstein kind of way, it's the duck and the rabbit, and trying to hold on to the thing being nameable, but it escaping its nameability at the same time was important for me in these pictures. And it's been an increasing concern for me. And I'm going to move again quickly through these. Then I went into a bit more of a melancholic phase where I started photographing later in the day. And I call this series The Dog and the Wolf. And I was interested very much in the tensions. So this is Giotto, one of my favorite paintings. And I was thinking about it when I made this, the flying and the falling, and the sense of ambiguity of space and of planar flatness versus verticality. I started photographing when there was very little light. I had a second child and was sort of stuck at home and couldn't get out of the house. But again, trying to use that, thinking about being, I'm a female artist. And so what is it I use that I can make work out of? And it is a frustration to me that so many male artists that make work about domesticity, it's seen as being daring and brave, whereas when women artists make work about domesticity, it's seen as being, well, of course you would, because that's what you're supposed to do. And do you photograph your babies? And I do photograph my babies, but I never show them as my artwork. And but I was stuck at home, and I was trying to think about how to do more work at home. And so I was back at home again and not in my studio. This is in it's just 2009. And photographing at the late end of the day when the sun is set. So The Dog and the Wolf is a time of day when you can still see, but light changes because of how you perceive the world. And using that sense of mystery that's just about a lack of perception and how your mind fills in what you can't see to make a kind of ridiculous magic that's verging on melodrama sometimes. And other times on a kind of etherealness. This was the counterpoint to my working at home when I could get into the studio and working with this glorious light, and thinking about synesthesia, and again, this idea of translation of language and of visuality. And the other work that I was doing at home was sort of mired in like blood and guts and meat stuff. I was working with like dead animal parts and this sort of more melodramatic palette. And then in my studio, thinking about how to translate, how to hold on to something, and what happens in that translation. And I was interested in the sensation of closing your eyes and imagining what something tastes like. And to sort of, the caveat is that the work was generated out of thinking imaginatively about last meals. I had read some accountings of prisoners' last meals, and then there was a book about famous chefs' last meals and what they would want to eat. And it struck me that the range from the kind of, the mother's milk, the very, very simple things where somebody just wanted like fresh, unpasteurized glass of milk, to the very, very elaborate kinds of meals. And then the prisoners' meals, which were very class-based, and, there were a lot of like sort of southern, more soul food just because of the population who's on death row. So thinking about how absurd and perverse it is to imagine your last meal and what that could even look like. So not trying to picture it as a factual thing or as an attractive thing, but trying to picture what an idea looks like. And I know that sounds really vague and kind of, loose, but it's been an increasing importance for me to think about, to think abstractly. And through this series, and then this, where I photographed in Italy and was photographing in these very incredible villas with incredible objects and real wealth instead of the kind of Povera that I was in my studio. This is another one of those. Made me... I stopped working in 2009, and I really felt like maybe I had just done everything that I had to do photographically. Maybe I had nothing more artistically to say, and I spent a year writing and reading, and I mentioned Gertrude Stein, and she's one of my favorite writers, but David Foster Wallace and Lydia Davis and Mary Gateskill and St. Augustine and a bunch of writers, Barth, going back to Barth and Deleuze and Guattari, contemporary theorists, trying to think about where I wanted my practice to be situated. I felt that the earlier work that I had been doing was always identified by what was in the picture. So its adherence to still life was its first. It was like the thing that people went to first. And I wanted instead for myself to be in dialogue with artists like, this is a Cy Twombly painting, who's one of my favorite painters. This is a Dieter piece. It's chocolate, and it's called Die Insel, the island, and it's made of it's either old chocolate or old meat, I can't remember. He would take like pieces of meat or pieces of chocolate. He worked in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Incredible, incredible artist. This is a Felix Gonzalez Torres piece. Jessica Stockholder, who is my colleague here at the university, we hired her last year, and she's fantastic. The kind of the dialogue that happens in a way that doesn't get named so easily, so you don't go grapes, apricot, plate, dish, napkin, but instead there's a formal dialogue that is maybe felt in your spleen or in your solar plexus or in your marrow or something, that isn't about articulating verbally, but that's about experience. And experience is a kind of knowledge. The experience that you have from smell and from taste and from touch and from other sensory input besides words. This is a Richard Tuttle piece, another artist who's been very important for me. And this Gertrude Stein quote that I had a show at the MCA last year, and Lauren Berlant, who teaches in the English department here, she included this in her essay on my work. A long dress fragment. Where is the serene length? It is there, and a dark place is not a dark place. Only a white and red are black. Only a yellow and green are blue. A pink is scarlet. A bow is every color. A line distinguishes it. A line just distinguishes it. So how do I make pictures? I spent a year writing, and I had a good friend who works for the press tell me that I should really stick with pictures and not ever try and publish my writing. It's very humbling. But I felt that it is a way that I know how to communicate. It's something that it's a language I can speak. I can speak a little bit of French, and photography for me is a way of communicating with the world. And so trying to figure out how to communicate a sense of all the stuff that I was feeling about the world, which included degrees of frustration and inarticulateness, verbally and visually. So I began to make this work that I call ill form and voidful. I started using magazine images and images from the web and whatever was out there, culling from the image archive that is everywhere around us, to build these still lifes that set up similar kinds of ambiguous spatial relationships. And for me, it's really important to talk about the work of home. On the one hand, you all have an idea about what home is. If I asked you what home is, everyone, well, of course you know what home is. There's no doubt about it, right? And yet home is one of the arenas, like love, where if we actually knew what it was and it was so taken for granted, you wouldn't have the humongous amount of media saturation about home. Everything from Martha Stewart to J.C. Penney to IKEA catalogs to the Cosby Show to Modern Family to all the reality TV shows to you name it, right? Sleepless in Seattle, everything, all the media that tells us what home is supposed to be. Even though, right, we know what it is, but the way that photographic media in particular shapes our expectations and our experiences of what home is for us. And so trying to, dismantle is not the right word, but trying to think about how that gets put together and the work of making home. And I mean it, both in a sort of feminist way, like the tremendous work of home, like, laundry and dishes and trying to keep things clean and lunches. And, even if you live alone, there's just like a lot of work that's involved in home. And then again, the ideological work of home in these pictures is something that is very important to me. And so in trying to pose these questions about how you encounter these scenes and seeing, so the scene and seeing as being two activities that happen simultaneously, but to try and make the viewer self-conscious and aware of your participation in the process of construction, to turn you into consumers and producers, to try and complete a certain, or set up a certain cycle. I use magazine images, and I also use three-dimensional objects. And some of the still lifes are very flat in that they're like flat on a wall, and I'm using paper and light to shift the expectations of the illusional space. And then this one has a peach pit. The peach pit that's on the flat surface was just resting on the flat surface. So there's this illusion of like flat and three-dimensional. And again, using the stains and liquidity and solidness and kind of trying to break those up. And I realized that just as with my earlier work, I could use light as a character in the space. And I'm going to stop with this picture. And there's about 15, 20 minutes for questions. So I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.